Good afternoon. I think we're starting on time this class, not early, so hopefully that's a step forward. All right. We're going to continue doing Excel stuff next week, so bring your computer on Monday and on Wednesday. On Monday, we're going to use it for an in-class, and on Wednesday, you're going to be using it for the quiz and that day's in-class exercise. And so of the two dates, Wednesday is definitely the most important day to bring your laptop or a laptop that you've checked out from the library, because you're going to need it for the quiz. On Monday, I'm going to show you how you can upload a spreadsheet to MU Online. That's not something that we've done. It's similar to how you uploaded Homework 1. It's just attaching a file to an assignment. But that's how I'm going to grade your quiz, is I'm going to actually look at the spreadsheet that you put together on Wednesday. So much further in the project, the weekend before Thanksgiving, on Friday, is when your project is going to be due. And even though you still have plenty of time for the project, I wanted to mention it again so that you can not procrastinate, just sort of keep it in mind, because the earlier start you get on that, the better time you'll have if you run into questions or uncertainties. You'll be able to ask me or discuss it with your classmates. This project, when I've done it in the past, most students have done really great, and I've been able to give them full credit, which helps the grade a lot. But occasionally, it's pretty obvious who started on the project Thursday afternoon. So don't be one of those people. Be one of the people who starts it this weekend, just a little bit each day, and then you'll sail through it and get full credit. Okay, so today we're going to give the subject of comparing internal rates of return a little more attention, because internal rate of return is useful as a screening tool to tell you yes or no to whether or not a project is viable, but it's less useful as a comparison tool, and we'll delve into a proof of that. But before we do, I got a really great question after class on Wednesday, and the question was about that bond problem that you had on the in-class exercise that day. Kind of just trying to understand the interpretation of what the results mean, because it's easy to break down the problem statement and identify the numbers associated with the variables and then plug those numbers into the formula. I mean, relatively easy. It's not negligible, but then understanding what that means is maybe the next level beyond. And so let's get to that next level. If you read the problem statement here, it says that the company that's issuing the bond is paying 6% per year. So this could be Bank of America, it could be GE. Whoever it is that's taking the money is going to pay interest for the bond. But yet, it says you want to receive a yield of 8% per year. So it's kind of a strange thing. What you're trying to do is you're trying to get more from this investment than the bond seller is actually going to be paying out. And so the question is, how do you get 8% return when the interest rate is only 6%? And the answer is that you pay less than the face value for the bond. And so here, when it was saying $864, this is the price that you should pay when you first buy the bond at year 0 if you want to achieve an 8% yield. And so if you do that, part of your return will come from the value of the interest, and then the other part of the return is going to be the fact that some years in the future, they're going to give you $1,000, which is the face value and the redemption value, but you only paid $864 for the bond to begin with. So you'd be making money in two ways. Nowadays, rather than selling bonds at a discount like this illustration, it's actually quite common for bonds to be priced at higher than their face value. And so, for instance, I think that if you saw a bond that was paying 7% interest, that would be so attractive, because if you go to a savings account, you'll be lucky to get 1%. And so some sort of an investment that's paying 7% is worth more than the face value because of how much interest it's paying. And so it may be that, for an example like this, if it was a $1,000 bond, the secondary market may be pricing that bond at greater than $1,000 simply because the interest portion of the payment is so valuable. And so that's why we have two different interest rates here. We have the interest rates that's being paid by the bond issuer. The yield is something separate that accounts for what the purchase price and the redemption price of the bond is. So you should be able to explain that if a question came up about, what are the two components of a bond's value. And one way to think about it is shopping. It seems strange. Why would a $1,000 bond be priced at less than $1,000? Well, if you go shopping, they'll say, oh, here's a coat that should cost $300. We normally sell it for $149.99, and today you can buy it for $89. Anybody know where that tag's from? Yeah, I think it's TJ Maxx or maybe Marshall's. A very distinctive thing that they do to try and make you think that you're getting a good deal, right? It's, wow, how can I not buy that? I have to. I'd be losing money. It's like getting $300 for $89. All right? So bonds, it's the same way. The face value and the value out on the market are not necessarily the same thing. So any questions about the interpretation of this bond situation? All right. So IRR, internal rate of return. We can use it for screening, and the criteria when it comes to screening is if the IRR for a project is higher than the MAR, then the project is viable. But what we can't do necessarily is we can't compare two different projects and know which one is best just from the IRR. And we'll look at an example that proves we should be careful. Now, in the homework, you are asked to compare for the lottery problem, where you won, how much did you win? $50 million? And so you win $50 million, but you're trying to look at whether you should take it all now or you should take periodic payments over time. In that example, in that homework problem, you're asked to calculate the IRR of the payout over time and compare it to the 2.5% that you will earn if you just take the lump sum and put it into the bank. Now, that's the one example of when you can compare interest rates because the starting amount is the same. The starting amount in both of those options is the same $50 million as a present amount. But most projects don't have exactly the same initial investment. And the thing that'll never steer you wrong is choosing the best project based on what gives you the most profit. Because an interest rate is kind of an abstract thing. It's good to have high interest rates on your investments, but you can't spend an interest rate. You can spend money. And so what you want to do is maximize profit. So here is the in-class exercise that we're going to be looking at today. We have two different projects. Let me pull up the PDF of that so you can read over the problem statement while I'm handing it out. You're going to set up an Excel spreadsheet. All right. Your first two columns of the spreadsheet, well, first three columns of the spreadsheet are shown there. You're going to need to calculate the internal rate of return for both projects and also the present worth of both projects to try and find out what looks better versus what definitely is better. Remember, if you were not warned about the challenges of comparing internal rate of return, the one with the highest interest rate may seem like the best alternative to you. But what we really want to do is maximize profits. I got a lot of extra handouts. I think that means people have started their weekend early. I'm glad that you're here today. It's the true believers that are in class today. We ought to have an attendance quiz, except for we're not going to. All right, so if we just looked at the IRRs, we'd get the wrong idea about how good Project A is. Because at first glance, if we're thinking about we want to have a nice high interest rate, it seems that Project A is pretty good. Here, Project A has an internal rate of return of 12.4%, and Project B has an internal rate of return that's lower, 10.28%. So all things being equal, you should take the project that has the higher internal rate of return. But here, not all things are equal. The main difference is that one of the projects, you have to invest more, but then you get more revenue out of it over time. You know, it's $50,000 of the original investment versus $85,000. Now these guys are borrowing money. Let's assume that they are borrowing from the bank at the MAR, 4%. And so what this means is they're going to the bank and they're taking money and they are paying the bank back at 4%, but then they're going to earn either 12% on the overall investment or 10% on the overall investment. But here's where the two things are different. If you can borrow and then reinvest a small amount of money, $50,000, or a large amount of money, $85,000, it's better to invest the large amount of money. So we prove that by looking at the present value. And I showed like the two different approaches for finding the present value. One is by finding the present value of each individual year and then summing those. Or you can just use the NPV function, which you add just the future values to, and it discounts it to the present, and then you combine that separately with the amount that's already at the present. So either approach will give you the same value, but you know, the one that is best is Project B. Project B is best because it gives you the most dollars, and that's what you're really after when you're operating a business, is maximizing your profits. And so the reason why you get more dollars is because Project B costs more to begin with, but it gives you a larger return on that investment over time. So it's a little bit of a confusing thing at first to say, well, it has the lower internal rate of return and it's more expensive. So why is it better? You know, what makes it better? And the thing that makes it better is, yeah, it's more expensive to begin with, but remember, you're buying it with borrowed money. And so you're buying something and you have to pay 4% for the privilege of borrowing, but then that thing that money that you borrowed is earning a return of 10.28%. So think of it more simply. What if you could go to one bank and withdraw money at 4% and then go across the street to their competitor, and their competitor is going to pay you 10.28% on your deposit? Well, you'd borrow as much as you possibly could under those circumstances. But what if you could only borrow $50,000 if you're going to put it into an account that pays 12.41%, or you can borrow $85,000 into an account that's going to pay 10.28%. And this is an example of where it's actually better to go for the lower interest rate if the account will let you put more money into it. And this isn't completely abstract, by the way. There are like real-world situations where this comes up. So for instance, earlier in the semester, we were looking at typical interest rates out there in the world. And one of the things we found was Everbank, which has what they're calling a yield pledge money market account. And they'll pay you 1.11% for a one-year period on a balance up to $250,000. And so if you deposit beyond $250,000, then it just goes to their normal kind of measly rate, which I think is around 0.4% or something. Now this other bank, by the way, is offering 5%. So it seems like, wow, 5%, and that's even for a checking account. So that's a little bit more convenient because you can access the money with your debit card, you can write checks against it. There aren't restrictions on the number of deposits or withdrawals in a month like there is for a money market account. So at first, this other bank seems like such a great deal, especially because they'll give you $50 on top of it. But then there's this little asterisk next to the APY. And I had to go really far down on the page before I finally found the information that that's only up to $5,000 and it's a rate that's valid for 6 months. And so if you could only have one account, you've got a big pile of money you need to put to work somewhere, is it better to earn 5% on $5,000 for 6 months or 1.1% on $250,000 for a year? And I had hoped I could calculate that and tell you like quantifiably which one is better, but then I got interrupted by a phone call. So maybe next year they'll know for sure. But I think you get the main idea. The conceptual difference here is that one of them has a pretty low cap on the amount they're willing to take and assign this tempting 5% return. I guess 5% on $1,000 would be $50, right? So it's $250 if it was for a year, but it's only for 6 months. So that's about $125 plus the $50 they're throwing in. So the value of it's roughly $175 of that investment. But 1.11% on $250,000, I think you're going to be making like $100 a month on that. So it's better to go with this one because of the limit. So if we think back about the in-class exercise, which of the two projects is better? you'll never, when you're picking projects, you'll never go wrong in just comparing the present worths or comparing the future worths. Now, incremental internal rate of return is what we'll get to on Monday, and that's a way of looking at how much more expensive one project is versus another. Any questions before we talk just very briefly about incremental analysis? Any questions about this illustration? What about the short answers? Here's how I put it for the short answer to the question of what does the present worth represent? Okay, the present worth represents the profit. So if you are going to be in the part of the problem where you're finding the present worth of this cash flow at 4%, you're paying the bank that you're borrowing the money from their interest. Then if you discount this cash flow diagram at 4%, this leftover $22,998, that represents what your benefits for doing the project are, the present worth of those benefits. And so it's the money that's left over. And not surprisingly, the higher the interest rate is from the bank that you're getting the money from, the smaller your profits are going to be. So, a greater fraction of that amount is going to the bank instead of to you if they charge 5% or if they charge 7% and so on. So on part C of the in-class exercise where it says explain which project should be selected and why, you should select project B. And the reason why is that's the project that will return the greatest profits to you. But then as a concept question, if you have to borrow money at the MAR, the present worth represents the profits that you get to keep, the present worth of the profits you get to keep after the bank's portion has been satisfied. So the main lesson that we've learned from doing this in-class exercise is that you can't compare a project by the IRR and from that necessarily know which project is better or worse. Now sometimes you can. It was just this example, I had to sort of be a little bit careful about how I created it. I had to make sure that it was pretty close so that one of them had a high IRR and the other one had the higher present worth. Oftentimes, the one that's better will have both the present worth that's the best and the higher IRR. So it's not that you should always choose the one with the lower IRR. It's just this is a special illustration of how IRR alone isn't going to tell you which one is best. Now, the one exception to this rule is the one that I've already explained to you from the homework, is if the original investment amounts are the same, then you should choose the one with the highest IRR. Because the whole reason that the difference arose was because of the different original investment amount. All right, so on Monday, what we're going to do is calculate something called the incremental internal rate of return. And an increment is the difference between two alternatives. And so in this illustration, we've got option A and option B. And it looks like option B is more expensive, but the reason why you'd buy the more expensive one, potentially, is that it has lower operating costs over time. You have to pay $19,000 per year instead of $25,000 per year. So at first glance, it may be the better alternative, especially because it seems to have a higher salvage value at the end of its useful life. Now, we're not actually going to calculate which of these two options is better, but what I want to illustrate is the idea of the increment. And so what you do in incremental analysis is you subtract the value for each row of the higher, more expensive alternative relative to the cheaper alternative. And so sometimes we'll compare 5 or 6 options to each other, and the way that you should organize them is from cheapest on the left to most expensive on the right. And then your comparisons are going to be in an increasing original investment amount. So here, the incremental cost is $20,000. And for that $20,000 more that you would pay for option B, the incremental benefit is $6,000 per year. Those are savings for expenses that otherwise you'd have to pay each year. And the incremental salvage value is $2,000. So the backside of the in-class exercise is pretty easy. I mean, if you know subtraction, you'll do just fine on it. But the point is to sort of lay the groundwork for the incremental analysis that we're going to do in class on Monday. And I guess one of the main things I'll reiterate is that when you're sorting alternatives, you always put the cheapest on the left and the most expensive on the right when you begin your comparisons. So calculate the incremental amount comparing project B to project A on the back of the page. All right. So for these two projects, option B is $35,000 more expensive, and it has an incremental benefit, an incremental revenue of $5,000 per year. So what we'll do on Monday is we're going to say, is it worth it? Is this extra $5,000 each year worth the $35,000 that you have to pay up front? And the only way we know is depending on what the interest rate is. Because remember, money in the future is worth less than money today. So you're going to be shelling out $35,000 in year 0. Well, all of these future amounts may not be worth very much if you have a high inflation rate. All right, let's talk about the project briefly with the extra time that we've got. How many of you, just by a show of hands, are leaning towards the personal finance project? And how many of you are leaning towards the analysis of the water network? And so then it looks like maybe some people are still undecided. All right. The one I'll talk about today, I'll do maybe a few tips and hints for the other project at a later date, but the project where you're doing the personal finance, you know, I suggest you should get an early start on that. And the easiest way to get started is just to pick a couple of these sections and work on maybe this weekend, the income and the regular expenses. And so sources of information for the income, there are a lot of websites that have gathered starting salaries for, you know, computer scientists, people who are working for the IT industry. Some of you I know are going into careers in safety or engineering. So there's a lot of really good data. When I was doing this project last year over in the UAE, they didn't have the same advantages that you've got, because in the UAE, the salary data isn't online in the same way as it is for the US. And so they had to rely more heavily on talking to recent graduates and maybe family members. But in the report that you're writing, you should be sure and document what sources that you were utilizing as, you know, what your assumptions are for income. But it's not just the starting salary, but it's also how the salary grows through your career that you're going to have to think about. And so you need to think about, find out in your career, like, what is the salary curve look like? You know, are there typical promotions that people get? For instance, if you're going to become an engineer, once you become licensed after about 5 years of practice generally, then your usefulness to the company increases a lot once you can start stamping plans without having everything you do checked by another engineer. So think about whether your career is going to be, you know, working in the IT industry, if there are certain certifications that make you more valuable, and how long it usually takes to get those certifications, or you know, an equivalent licensing system within safety, the safety field. So income isn't just about the starting salary, but it's also about thinking how it's going to grow over time. And in the handout I give you, I talk a lot about the role of cost of living adjustments and how that will change the income. The other thing about regular expenses, what I really like when it comes to the expense analysis is not just to use like websites that say, you know, the average American spends $1,200 a year on car insurance. You know, like the average American and what is the average car and what's the average location. It's just so generic that it's really useless. And so what I'd like you to do is get specific data about how much you're going to spend on communications, how much you anticipate budgeting for entertainment, what you would expect to pay for rent in whatever cities that you might consider living in, and so on. So do like a real-world analysis. Go to the grocery store with your parents and find out, or maybe you do your own shopping already. Who knows? It could be either way. But go to the grocery store and get a feel for how much things cost, you know, a week's worth of groceries. And that, I think, will give you a lot of good real-world data to draw on for figuring out your regular expenses. So my suggestion is just break it up into sections, do a little bit at a time each weekend, and then the project will just sort of write itself. If you keep notes on what you found out, just open an Excel, or not an Excel file, but open like a Word document where you paste in the links to websites that you use. You know, maybe keep a notepad of what you're thinking about on the project, and then it's so much less intimidating than trying to sit down and have that entire project to do all at once. All right, so before I let you go, let's just take one last look at these reminders for next week. Bring your computer to class on Monday and Wednesday, especially Wednesday, because we're having our quiz. And that's it. I'll see you next time.